Hi, everybody. This is Adriana Proser. You should be here for the AAMC Label Writing webinar. And let me just introduce myself. I'm the John H. Foster Curator for Traditional Asian Art at Asia Society in New York, which you see behind me, New York anyway. And I have been at Asia Society for 11 years. I was at the Philadelphia Museum of Art for about 7 years before that. And I've worked over the course of my career on over 40 exhibitions. This webinar I'm going to be co-moderating with Tracy Glab, who is Curator of Collections and Exhibitions at the Flint Institute of Art. Tracy has curated over a dozen special exhibitions, including the most recent Point of View Contemporary African American Art from the Elliott and Kimberly Perry collection. And prior to her position in Flint, she worked at the Detroit Institute of Arts, where she edited several collection and exhibition catalogs and served also as the editor of the museum's scholarly journal. As you're going to hear from Tracy in a very short while, her work history gives her a multifaceted perspective on what makes a good label. So I'm really looking forward to working with Tracy today as we moderate this webinar. And we have two esteemed panelists with us today. Ulysses Dietz, who is Chief Curator and Curator of Decorative Arts at the Newark Museum. Hi, Ulysses. And he is a curator who has worked on over 100 exhibitions covering all aspects of decorative arts, from colonial to contemporary. And among his great amount of work, one of his projects that he's most proud of is his work on the museum's 1885 Ballantine House, which was named as a historic landmark in 1985. And he also wrote or installed a groundbreaking, transformative reinterpretation of that house between 92 and 1994 in an installation called House and Home. He's also been a prolific writer. I'm not going to go into too much detail with these introductions because you have further bios that are actually on the website. So let me move on now to Stephanie James, who's Curator and Collection Educator at the Mott Warsh Collection, also in Michigan, correct?
Yes.
And this is one of the largest privately owned collections of African American art in the United States. She is Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art with a focus on the art of the African diaspora. She worked for nearly 16 years at the Detroit Institute of Arts, serving as Assistant Curator of the General Motors Center for African American Art and in various appointments in the museum's education department. She also has organized numerous exhibitions, most recently the Essential Self Meditations on the Politics of Identity at the Detroit Artists Market, and also has contributed a lot of her work in writing. So it now falls to me to just give you, those of you who are here with us today, I know we all warmly welcome you, and just to give you a sense of what the format is going to be, it is going to be a discussion with co-moderators and panelists. So Tracy and I are going to be co-moderating, but we'll also be chiming in from time to time because we both have had quite a bit of experience with label writing. So it's going to be more of a conversation, although we'll be moving things along in terms of organization. Tracy is going to get the discussion started with opening question and provide an overview of the topics we're going to discuss. Then Tracy and I will take turns asking questions of the panelists. If you have any questions for the panelists that we haven't asked, please submit them to us via the comment box on your computer, and we'll have some time at the end to address some of these questions. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Tracy.
Hi, everyone. My first question is for Ulysses, whether for both Ulysses, Stephanie, and Adriana, but it is, did you ever receive any formal training for label writing, either in graduate school or some other school, or was it on the job? What was your training like? Ulysses.
Well, really, it was on the job. I remember as an undergraduate working at the Yale Art Gallery in New Haven, I had to write a label on a piece of furniture for a seminar, and this is like 40 years ago. So it stuck with me because the critique was you wrote too much, you mentioned the wrong things, this isn't important, your style is boring, something like that. But mostly I plunged right into writing labels in 1980 when I started at the museum, and I don't know how many thousands of labels I've written. And I guess you get better at it with time, but no one even coached me on how to do it at the museum. It all came up at staff meetings over the years where we would talk about the way the labels ought to be written. So somebody must have been coming up with something formal that they were sharing, but basically it was on-the-job training.
And for me as well.
Go ahead.
For me as well, when I was in graduate school, I did have one seminar in which I helped with a number of other graduate students work on an exhibition that was ultimately at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was an exhibition that was being curated by our professor. And I remember writing labels and getting feedback that that they were basically too descriptive, and I remember at that time realizing that there's a big difference between what we need to what we write about when we're in graduate school in terms of producing formal analysis types of descriptions and what one has to do when one is writing for the general public. And so that was a little bit of an introduction, but really, again, it wasn't until I was on the job and having to write labels all the time that that I received my training, which was basically by doing and by getting feedback from whoever was the curator of my department, colleagues, editors, and so on. I will say that something else that really contributed to my own personal philosophy with regards to labels was that my first official job at a museum was working as a visiting scholar in the education at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So I had a lot of engagement with the public in that position, and then I moved from that position into a curatorial position, and it was really having that experience working directly with the public that made me realize that that there's a lot of questions that the public has, ways of looking at things that the public has that are very different from the way we're taught to look at things or discuss things when we're in graduate school. So that was my experience.
Stephanie, what about you?
My training in label writing came more so on the job. It certainly wasn't approached in graduate school. However, I was working in the museum while in graduate school for many years, and so I often felt like, to some degree, I was still a test part of the test market myself as I was going through my education. So quite often I approached label writing with some of the things that would come to mind to me if a particular object or subject area in art history, it was a particular subject area that I wasn't as familiar with. So on-the-job training, but it was supplemented with workshops. This was during the earlier part of my career when I was in museum education and the education department at the Detroit Institute of Arts. And while there, I'd say that was probably late 90s, early 2000, we were introduced to the teachings of Chandler Screven, for one, a psychologist who did a lot of work in visitor studies, focused a lot on looking at public environments in which informal education might take place, and seeing the museum as one of those. And he focused largely on creating exhibits, moving curators and educators to develop exhibits that were goal-oriented and had opportunities for discovery within the exhibit as a reward of sorts for our audiences. We were also introduced to visual thinking strategies, a approach developed by Abigail Housen and Philip Yenawine, which was pretty much anchored in stage development in visual literacy, focused on the development of critical thinking skills. And toward my latter years at the Detroit Institute of Arts, we were introduced to the work of Beverly Sorrell, which was couched in the notion of the big idea of extrapolating on a big idea in exhibits with the idea that there would be a big idea that would be unified by all of its parts.
Can
Great, thank you. Oh, go ahead, Ulysses.
I was going to say that the sort of on-the-job training idea, it made me think, and what Stephanie was talking about really made me think about this. When we launched on the Ballantine House project in 1992, our mandate from the Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Fund, from whom we got a huge grant, was, well, one of the things that we had to do was, and I'm quoting this, entirely change the way you operate forever, which was a pretty aggressive thing to demand for even $1.5 million. But what we did is we created a way to produce labels that was collaborative, and it started with the curator for the basic content, and then all of our labels for that massive undertaking and for the next 15 years were edited by the education director. So basically she taught us what Stephanie was talking about. She taught us how to write labels according to the way she had learned about the way audiences read labels and what they wanted to get from them. So it was a hugely informative process about how to write a label for your audience, not for your friends. So, and I would say that in the last 10 years, we've drifted away from that at my museum for all sorts of reasons, not out of any malice, just because necessity has pulled us in different directions. But I'd really love to get back to that because I really enjoyed that collaboration.
Well, from my perspective and the training that I received, well, it wasn't formal in terms of schooling. I did take a museum seminar class where we did an exhibition on campus, but we basically took our labels from what we wrote our reports on, so it really wasn't any kind of formal instruction. I did start my museum career 16 years ago in education, like Stephanie, and at the Detroit Institute of Arts. And what I worked on was not labels, but I assisted the educator who was in charge of surveys. And part of my job was to do tracking and timing surveys where you watch visitors, how long they, you actually time them, how long do they look at a work of art, how long do they look at a label, and the results were really fascinating because, number one, we were all horrified that they didn't spend nearly as much time as we wanted them to at all of these different stops. So from the education standpoint that I received, it was really informative to watch how visitors act in the galleries. And the other impression that I took away from my experience was the perception that curators really wanted as much information as possible on the label at their level, at a PhD or master's degree level, and didn't really want to budge from that point of view, that they were the experts and that it was important for them to control what that content was. 3 years later, I was still at the museum and I took a job as an editor. So things changed once more in terms of what I learned about labels. So this time I was responsible for making sure things were grammatically correct, spelling was correct, most of all consistency among different departments, making sure that all labels conform to a house style so that it would be ideal for the visitors to have a consistent reaction to the labels. You know, you can have the greatest content in the world, but if you have a spelling mistake or a grammatical error, you automatically lose credibility. So it was very important from our point of view as editors to make sure that that was consistent, as well as defining words and being consistent with tombstone information and textual information, all those kinds of inconsistencies that can trip you up if that you really need a third person to review and make sure that it's okay. Then 5 years after that, I took yet another turn in my museum career, and so now I'm a curator at the Flint Institute of Arts, and it was very exciting for me because now I was responsible for the content. And here at the museum, we're much smaller than the DIA, and the education department here is mostly concerned about outreach and classes and tours. So the labels were really completely controlled by the curator, the curatorial department, and the director. So I had a little bit of free reign. I could do whatever I wanted, but I found that I went back to my roots because it was still important to me to consider what the visitor was encountering. How long were they looking at things? Was the content being communicated in a way that got across to them? But I completely, again, from these three different perspectives, I also understood the frustration that curators have from the other side of the issue of wanting to communicate all these exciting things that we know about the objects, and we want to make sure as much of it is on the label as possible because we're excited about the works and we want people to be excited about those same things that we get excited about. And I see that sometimes, not sometimes, most of the time, curators also know what those things are, and sometimes the visitor doesn't quite know what questions to ask about those things. So we know what those issues are, and I think that it's important to have a balance there and to stay open-minded, because ultimately I think it boils down to we all want to create a meaningful experience for a visitor, because otherwise we're going to be out of business. And we just may disagree on the best way to get to that same experience. And I don't think there is a cookie-cutter answer, and that each museum and each curator is going to have a different way. And honestly, we'll have to figure it out for their audience. And I often, like I said, begins with an open mind and understanding who your audience is and who you want your audience to be. So the questions that we're going to ask the panelists today basically get at these issues and cover the topics, hopefully we had time, of experience, audience, authorship, and evaluation. And this webinar is not meant to be all-inclusive or comprehensive, but really to get the dialogue going from a curatorial perspective and really start this discussion. So, Adriana, I'm going to pass it over to you to ask the next question.
Okay. Thank you, Tracy. And I think maybe for the sake of variety, let's start with Stephanie this time. And my question to you is, are there resources or guidelines that you use to inform your label writing now? I mean, you just talked to us about your, essentially your training. Now you're years down the road with lots of exhibitions behind you. How do you work now?
Well, ironically, I rarely utilize any other resources other than I would say that I'm drawing on those many methodologies that I've been introduced to and exposed to. My situation is very different now. It's a very autonomous situation in terms of working for a private collection, and we just happen to be a private collection that shares its work publicly, and I'll speak a little bit more on that later. But the interesting thing is, in preparation for thinking about this whole webinar, it made me realize, there's a whole lot of stuff you could be referring to. Oh, it would be nice to go back and revisit that, even though I'm utilizing many of the concepts. And I think, like I said, over time, and I think Ulysses, mentioned this too, that over time you just kind of develop a flow and a feel for what you want to get across and what has worked and what audiences tend to even share in terms of feedback. But so I guess my short answer is no, I don't have any hard, fast resources that I am drawing that strictly guide me in the writing.
Thank you. Ulysses, you actually started to get into this having talked about this period of about 15 years where you had this very formal way of creating the labels through collaboration. And you say things have started to swing back to more of an independent style of writing labels. But are there guidelines that you follow?
Well, there is a museum style. I mean, there are certain basic formal issues that the museum's editor, and we have an in-house editor who is a copy editor essentially, but he'll also spot things that are inconsistent or too obscure just because he sets himself in the place as an audience. He's not an art person. He's a copy editor. But in terms of resources, really what I'm doing is I keep referring back to all the experience of label writing. I mean, and I've got 35 years of label writing, and it started out bad, and I hope it's gotten better in those years. But I seem to remember that with each exhibition, you're looking at what is the content, who's the curator, what's the audience, how difficult or easy is the material you're trying to put across. Our Asian art curator, when she's trying to talk about Hinduism or Buddhism, it's a much more complex topic for most of our audience than talking about furniture and pots. So she has a bigger challenge on how to filter her content. What I remember dealing with the education department, and let me just preface that by saying the reason we've stopped doing it is that our education director used to have a lot more free time, and so she would read every label that went into the museum with an eye as a content and an educational editor. and we would self-edit. The computers used to have education level parameters so that when you type something, it could tell you what level is this written at. Maybe they still have that, I just don't know where it is. But I know for the Ballantine House, we tried to keep everything at middle school level, and while the anxiety about dumbing down crops up in people's heads, that the middle school level is fine for most label copy as long as you're not getting into something very complicated or intense. But to just go back to our process is that the education director, and it was the director because the education department wasn't that big, so the director was sort of the chief editor for content that way. But she would come at us with notions of smaller words, not dumb words, but you don't need to use complicated French terminology for something when you can use something in plain English. And she also used to give us guidelines like, well, what's the point? What's the big idea you're trying to get at for this object in this context? And you might show a single object in 5 different shows and have completely different labels for every single use of that object. Because the real bottom line that kept getting driven home to us is you can't say everything about everything. You have to focus on what the main point of this exhibition is at this time. Unless you're doing general exhibition galleries, but we don't do any galleries that aren't entirely thematic. Every gallery in our museum is always based on some sort of a theme, and those themes change over time. Does that answer your question?
Yes. I don't know, Tracy, if you have something to add.
No, no, I don't. Other than it is a work in progress, and it constantly evolves. And the things that I thought I had figured out, and then I think that the art object does often dictate, just to echo Ulysses, the content of the label, because you can have something that you think you have a style guide and you think you have it worked out of what paragraph is going to deal with what, and then you get a different medium of art or a different type, and it totally changes everything. So it is, to me, a work in progress, and I'm constantly learning on the job.
I mean, I would say for us at Asia Society as well, I mean, certainly there are guidelines in terms of what we call the tombstone information or the caption information that goes across lines. But then I know that there's, in terms of label content, there's a big difference between what I would include in a label and our curator for modern and contemporary art might include in a label. I'm working with traditional material all the time, and often I feel that there's, especially with Asian art, there's more, perhaps a stronger need for contextual information if people are going to be able to understand what they're looking at. So I think I very much think about the exhibition sort of in the way that Stephanie and Ulysses were talking about it, in terms of, often I think that many good exhibitions are trying to tell a story, and all your objects are kind of characters in that story. What am I going to choose to say about that particular object, that particular character, so that it continues the theme that I want to tell, or that I'm telling.
My question for the panelists, to follow up on the idea of guidelines, is, do you have any restrictions, self-imposed or institutionally imposed, such as word count, the use of foreign words, referring to objects that are not in the gallery, or any other kind of rule book kind of issues that come up? Ulysses.
Well, yes. Let's move along. No, and I think this has drifted over time too. I don't know if we have an absolute word count, but the sort of general premise of 100 words for a basic label. If we call there's the tombstone and there's what we call the chat, and I think it again depends on the object and the context of the exhibition you're in, how long the chat should be. The bigger the exhibition and the more the objects, the shorter the chat on any given label should be, unless you're at a key object that explains the whole section or a big sub-theme or something like that, then it can be longer. But the fact of the matter is, as Stephanie, I'm sure, knows, as you all know, is that the audience stops reading after a certain amount. You can do a certain amount by cutting a long label up into small chunks, but basically people will stop. It's just like memos that you get in your office after the first paragraph you stop reading. And so you have to be conscious of that. If you don't want to lose your audience, you have to give them the most important thing up front. And then you can write longer labels knowing that only certain audience members, the really heavy-duty museum goers, the art, the culture vultures, are going to read every single word that you've written. And you can write labels in layers like that. And all through the Ballantine House, we wrote all of the, I produced basically all of the content, thousands and thousands of words for this huge installation, and then worked with the designer and consultants and the educators to hone them down. But we knew that a certain amount of our audience was going to come in and go through the entire Ballantine House installation in 15 minutes. And so we created, by a sense of size and placement of words, a story that they could get in that 15 minutes. And then we also accounted for the people who go label by label and read every single thing in a context of a museum exhibit, and we provided hours of pleasure for them as well. So you can do both things in one label, but I think, or in one exhibition. But I think labels, I mean, shorter is better, but that doesn't. But shorter is more difficult than longer. Trying to, especially if, again, our Asian curator and I battle with this all the time, and she can't argue with me because she's in India. But you know, when you're trying to explain a Buddhist figure from the 12th century to a layperson, it could take a lot more verbiage than that this is a gray stoneware clock made in Trenton in 1850. I mean, there's a whole, it's just, so then you have to layer your labels to make sure the most important information for you, or at least you think the audience thinks is the most important, comes first. So there is a place for big labels, but we try to put all the big chat in large type at the beginning or at sections through an exhibition so people know they're supposed to stop and read for a few more minutes, and it will encourage them, we think, to take that time. But we just know that if we write too much, people will lose the audience. That's
Stephanie?
That's the way to end it.
Well, I'm starting to feel like my answers are going to break all the rules that I was taught, even. But I think it's worthwhile for me to explain a little bit more at this point about the collection I'm dealing with. First, I will say that, yeah, in terms of word count, yeah, probably break the rules. My labels can run anywhere from 200 to 300 words in count. But let me, I know, yeah, Ulysses. But so let me explain the situation. The Matt Walsh collection is a, like I said, a private collection that's publicly shared. We go about that by loaning works of art. I curate small thematic exhibits to go on loan to various public spaces in this region, in the region of Flint, Michigan, the metro area. These are non-traditional art spaces. These are places like the public library, the health department. We have 3 churches in our partnership, community partnership. We have universities and colleges, spaces on universities and colleges in this area. All in total, about I'd say there's about 12 venues that where I'm rotating shows, not necessarily one show going from place to place, but often various themes being explored in groups of work. So the exhibits themselves are dictated by the space itself. in many situations. I'm not in a museum gallery. I'm making a wall in a space intended for other use, sometimes the waiting room within the health department, turning that into a gallery. The point being to make fine artwork available and accessible to a public that we feel may not be taking advantage or may not be so inclined to go visit the area, the Flint Institute of Arts or other art centers in the region. And so trying to come into their space, into their home of sorts, to share this work. So the exhibits can vary from 5 works to 20 works, depending on the space itself. And so my labels then sort of fall in line with what the space dictates, how much work I have to share. But because we're not in a museum setting, we're not in a space where people are coming and expecting to encounter fine art, I want to provide information, try to answer as many questions reasonably that they might have. Also because there is not an educator, a docent, or someone nearby to seek if there are more questions. So that may explain why my approach has been very different from all of what how I was trained to carry out this mission. But we're largely guided by an educational mission.
Well, I think your answer, Stephanie, is perfect to segue into the questions about audience. Adriana, do you have a question for them about?
Yeah, I do. And actually, I just wanted to add that that I at Asia Society for our shows, we tend to have for object labels, we have usually 100 and 150 word labels, and part of what dictates the size of the label is the size of the label ramp and the size of the typeface. So I think we have to, as curators, remember that sometimes there are other factors that have control over what we do in terms of creating copy. And for didactics, intro didactics tend to be about 300 words, 350 words. Section text about 250 to 300, something like that. But moving on to the next question, we wanted to think about Ulysses, and I think that as a curator who works in a city, a smaller city, with a mixed population, you may have some thoughts about this, and that's what political and cultural issues are of concern to your institution, and then once you've talked about that, think about how this may relate to how you communicate to the audience through the labels.
Well, I could say that's a loaded question, but it actually really isn't, because at this stage in the history of the city of Newark, and Newark is 10 miles from Manhattan, but if you ignore New York City and you simply look at the 30-mile radius around the city of Newark, you have 2.5 million people that represent about 100 different ethnicities and countries of origin. And so basically what we have in the museum is about equally diverse as the population that surrounds us. And so we're conscious with everything we do that we want to make the community that's within the city, which is very diverse, happy, but we also want to make the community outside the city, outside of the borders of the city, in suburban Essex and Morris County, Union County, Passaic County, Bergen County, all the geographical area around us. We want to be able to appeal to them. So we have basically this sort of troublesome idea: we want to be all things to all people, which is always a recipe for failure if you try too hard at it. So we're very conscious of that. Really, where we target, where we really focus on specific cultural issues is when we're doing thematic exhibitions that are where the theme is targeted on a specific culture, whether we're working something in the Asian department, the African art collection, or the decorative arts collection, which might be we're trying to deal with New Jersey issues, New Jersey history, New Jersey pride. We're trying to figure out what that is and where that might be. So, I mean, I think that I don't think what we're assuming is that our audience is very diverse. I mean, we know this from audience tracking, that we have a very diverse audience. In a lot of ways, we hit the same targets that all museums do in terms of demographics and education and age and all of that. But we also have a much stronger ethnic mix, ethnic diverse mix in our audience, and so we're always conscious of trying to make the labels friendly. I don't even know how else to say that, because there's not we want them to be readable to the widest range of people who come to the museum. And I mean, that's sort of the main issue. We do not allow ourselves to be pulled or pushed politically very strongly, or we very strongly try not to do that. So unless I'm misunderstanding your the question, which I've got in front of me here, but we basically have it's not one size fits all, but our approach to all of our audience is that we want to make the content of all of our exhibitions accessible. When we have a specific thematic exhibition, it's still divided because there may be a target audience, but we want to make sure that the non-target audience gets just as much out of the exhibition as the target audience does. It's kind of a fatal error to be too focused and then to forget everybody else. Did that make sense?
Thank you. And Stephanie, your collections, actually like my collections, are very focused collections, but that is or can be a completely different issue as to whether there are political or cultural concerns that you focus on when you create written materials about the collection. Do you have, is there a particular focus that your institution takes?
Well, you know, the focus of the Mount Warsh collection is post-World War II art made by artists of African heritage and artists of other heritage who happen to take up Africans or African Americans as subject in their works, or their work may encompass African American or African culture as a subject in the work. Because African American artists still tend to be less known to the general public and are still a minority in most museum collections, we feel it's important to include a brief biography incorporated in the label text, and that accounts for the word length to some extent too, which even though it's sort of dealt with in, well, sometimes it's dealt with under individual headings and sometimes it's kind of integrated. But yeah, so that's a huge part of our aim, is to make I don't know where that came from.
No, that was my computer.
Oh.
I didn't know what it was. It was my Skype. 。
Skype. Yeah, so because it's important to us to share that information. We feel it's important to share, for instance, the extent of an artist's formal education or the means by which they may have obtained that education, in addition to where the work fits into, you know, art history and significant contributions they may have made. Again, trying to fill a gap of sorts. So while the our audience, we see our audience as being very diverse, although the city of Flint is predominantly African American. I don't know the actual percentages of the demographics, but because we're in public spaces, we do draw pretty diverse audiences. But the issue is, it's interesting sometimes when we talk about, for instance, collections directed with a specific focus, particularly addressing African American art or artists. One thinks that that is intended for an African American audience, but the absence or the limited exposure of this art is a shortcoming for all of our audiences, not just African American audiences. So I don't know, I think I've said a few things, but we are guided to some extent by the interest in making these works available to our communities, and in some cases allowing them to to see a face. It's important in some cases to know that the works are made by African Americans, and just to learn about the you know, great many artists there are that so many people just aren't aware of.
Thank you. And Tracy, at the Flint Institute of Arts, do you feel that there are political and cultural issues that that you feel compelled to try to address in your labels?
Not specifically per se, but I think that just, you know, I agree with the other panelists in that we are aware of the diversity of our audience and who we're trying to attract. So we do try to explain and provide as much cultural context to labels as possible, not assume that people know, you know, stories about the New Testament or the Bible that deal with Christianity, but we're defining that and going a step further, not assuming everyone that's coming to our museum is a Christian or that, you know, that kind of thing. So I think we are trying to address it. We don't have any specific agendas other than just trying to make things accessible to a broad swath of the population.
Thanks.
So to follow up with that question on political and cultural issues, does anyone do audience surveys or other types of investigation or evaluation to engage new audiences?
I'll jump in.
Anyone jump in who wants to?
I mean, I think there the answer is kind of yes and no, and it ends up being sort of a matter of resources. We, in the past, and I'm only saying because we aren't doing it right now because we don't have that person in place, but we've done sort of pre-exhibition surveys to talk about titles and topics to sort of get a sense of audience interests and what kind of titles, what kind of standard or iconic images out of an exhibition would appeal to the audience. Some of this is just bald marketing. We're trying to figure out what are we going to choose that will help sell an exhibition to an audience. But we do that and we do audience surveys within the institution. While an exhibition is up, we do some tracking. We do audience surveys as people are coming in and out of the museum. We are now in the process of trying to, just under requirements, trying to do more follow-up. A lot of this has to do with, then we could get into a whole side issue about complying with grant requirements, but essentially the resources involved in serious follow-up studies is a real challenge for any institution that doesn't have huge departments to handle this and huge resources to pay for it. So I wish we did, and if I had all the power in the world and the money to do it, we would follow up on every exhibition to do post-summative surveys as to how successful the label content was and how the audience responded to that. Even with a big project like the Valentine House, much of our audience survey research is anecdotal rather than formalized, because even that grant funding ran out before we had done all the work we wanted to do.
Stephanie, what about you?
At this time, we do not engage in any audience surveying, any formal evaluation. It is something I would certainly like to explore. It's more so due to limited staffing, which consists of myself as curator and collection educator and a part-time registrar / curatorial assistant / we do a little bit of everything. But I guess, well, while it may not respond directly to the labels themselves, I do try to conduct on-site visits and do art talks in many of the community spaces and get a sense even from that. I mean, I can tell in the course of the way a gallery talk goes, whether or not anyone has read a label, how new all the information I'm sharing is. But it is something I would like to pursue in the future.
Adriana?
At Asia Society, we do not do formal visitor surveys, but we do always have comment sheets with specific questions on them outside of the galleries, and the curators always judiciously read those, and there is a question on there about the content, the level of the content, and sometimes they can be quite helpful, especially when when you have people who are serious filling them out. It can give you clues as to whether or not you've been successful getting the stories and information across that you wanted, because people sometimes will say very frankly, need more information. Occasionally, you'll get a good, positive, excellent label copy kind of comment, or should be more maps. That kind of thing comes up on those sorts of surveys.
We don't do any surveys here for labels. We have, like you, comment cards available and an exit survey about the overall museum experience. And but I do try to go out into the galleries and talk to visitors whenever I can, and it's more anecdotal. And of course, I'm totally contaminating the results because they figure out that I'm the curator asking a question. But yeah, I wish we I understand Stephanie's point about the issue of staffing. It just takes a lot of work to do that, execute it, and then analyze the results. However, there are some students at the University of Michigan, Flint, that have been working with us specifically about technology in our audio tour, but they have been working with us in determining what visitors want in terms of that. But I haven't seen the results yet. But that is one resource that we've been availing ourselves of in terms of technology.
And Tracy, I would just add too, that's a great point though about the taking advantage of the opportunities to utilize students, interns, and whatnot for that purpose. But another thing that I think is important to factor in is, as you say, not only analyzing the results, but then making it a priority to implement and really utilize those results in a next direction or changes. And unfortunately, sometimes that can be affected by resources and staffing.
So we were talking a little bit earlier about community and the community that our institutions serve, and I think most of us, or all of us, really pretty much agreed that we are trying to reach out to as broad a community as possible, as many people who are in our communities as possible. Do you currently, or have you at any time in the past, included your audience or some of your audience in the process of label writing? Ulysses.
Well, my automatic reaction to that is no, and you can imagine that raises the hackles on every curator. Doctors don't do audience surveys to find out how they should treat their patients. They do what they're taught to do. And I think that dismissing curatorial expertise and training is a very dangerous road to go down. I am not about the auto-curated exhibition where the public curates the show. That would, on the other hand, we in fact routinely go to people in the community, and that can be defined in all sorts of different ways, to ask them to respond to something in the exhibition. Here's this object, it's in this exhibition, tell us what you think about it. So that kind of having a community layer of participation in the content of an exhibit by soliciting personal responses to objects or ideas in an exhibition, but making it clear that that is in an audience voice, not in a professional voice, because I think you can get, and of course, I mean, it's just like a more microscopic version of having a performance artist come in and put together a gallery based on your collection, which we've also done, and which is a totally personal response to the objects. It's not about expertise, but about emotional response. So I think there are certainly ways to solicit community voices into exhibitions, but I don't think we've quite gotten to the point of letting them write labels. Now, on the other hand, if there's an object you don't understand and you think the community might have some insight into it or some additional insight to it based on personal experience, cultural background, you can always, I think it's a perfectly valid thing, it's not so much expertise, but personal connection to something, that you can certainly do that. But I just say it's something that needs to be treated very carefully and not just as an automatic response. Oh, we're the People's Museum, therefore they should write our labels.
I'm sorry, but let me just ask a quick follow-up, because when you said that you do from time to time solicit public response, then are those responses shared with the audience, and if so, how?
Oh, I mean, the idea would be that again, it depends on the context of the exhibition, but you would have people respond to. I'm trying to think sort of quickly about how to describe it quickly. You have somebody in the community respond to a specific object. What do you feel about this object? What does this object mean to you? And that obviously there's some sort of cultural context involved there. And then you include that label in the exhibition, formatted or highlighted or colored in a different way, so that and you make that part of the overall exhibit, that there are going to be community voices in this exhibition. Mm-hmm. And so the curatorial voice, the museum's official voice versus the community voice are shown as two separate things. So there's no confusion as to who's responding to what. And I can't think of what I'm thinking of particularly years ago. I went to the Cleveland Museum, and they they had, and there was no particular theme about it. I think they had invited members of the community in to go through the museum, pick their favorite object, and write a label about it. You know, what does this mean to me? And it was a great way of showing a huge range of public responses to kind of famous works of art. We haven't done that, but I think that's a perfectly valid way to go. But there are more subtle and nuanced ways to get community input. We are working on an exhibition right now, an enormous exhibition about Islamic art from the entire Islamic world, from ancient times to the present. It's a little ambitious, but we are talking about the possibility of how to bring community voices into that and what that might mean and how we do it. But it would be along those lines. We're not letting people write our labels. We're having people in the community to respond to what these objects mean to them.
Thank you. And Stephanie, how about you?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Ulysses said. In my current post, that does not happen. I have not utilized the community voice directly in label writing. I can think of, I'm pretty sure I know there were instances where we did that at the Detroit Institute of Arts. Tracy, you can probably recall some instances as well. It may have been more so in my latter years there by the time which I was in the curatorial division and may or may not have been as involved. It may have been more of an education led project. But I can even recall opportunities or situations, exhibits where I utilized community voice in my work at the DIA. Sometimes in panel labels and I'm sorry, in labels themselves, but what comes directly to mind, I think I utilize it more in the format of audio tours as a means of incorporating community voice. And as Ulysses spoke of, it was more in terms of a response, emotional response, or what certain works of art tended to evoke in various viewers and how they relate it to the subject matter or larger themes that we were exploring.
Yeah, yes, I remember at the DIA they would bring in like a baseball player to talk about the painting of a baseball player, or a botanist talk about a flower painting, that kind of thing. And as well as in the reinstallation, they did some community voices, whether it was a scholarly voice or an average person voice on different pieces. The closest we've done that is not labels per se, but we did a participatory experience or event at the Flint Institute of Arts. We had an exhibition of political cartoons, and they were political cartoons from around the world that did not have captions, so they were just the image. And so we deliberately chose to just have a label with the artist's name and the country where they came from. And then we provided post-it notes for people to post their comments on the cartoon all around the actual cartoon. So that was a way of involving the community, and it was an interesting exercise because we got some really insightful comments. It was an election year, so we also got some very heated back and forth of conservative versus liberal. And then we also got, 12-year-olds saying some inappropriate things. So it was an interesting thing to try out. But I agree with Ulysses. I don't think turning over the label content to the community is the right thing to do. In most cases, I think it has to be a specific type of exhibition or engagement exercise that is being tried out.
Thanks. Tracy, I think you were going to ask the next question, but I think we kind of covered it.
Yeah, I think so too. We just got a question that came in about this question, so I'm just reading it. The person writes, I'm curious as to whether any of the panelists consult audiences not for expertise but for content. For example, testing a label with visitors and asking them to cross off information they find to be a barrier and circling content they find helpful. Anyone have that experience? I have not. I can say that.
We haven't done that. I think it's a really good idea, but that's so labor intensive it would crush us. I mean, people don't. We barely have time to get our labels written sometimes. And I mean, the realities are there's a lot we could do if we had the resources to do them. And I think the idea of, I mean, you couldn't do this for every label. Can you imagine? I mean, we actually cut the director out of the label editing because that became such a bottleneck. So now it's just the curator and the marketing staff do the editorial and the education staff. But I think the idea of every once in a while soliciting members of the visitors to come, would you come and read a few labels? And I mean, that's a lot of work to do that properly. But I think it could be really useful. I know that sounds like I'm giving up power or something, but because it's one of the things that we try to guess what the audience wants to know. And what the audience wants to know is very important to us, because something I learned, it was a tough lesson, is that what I care about is not what the audience cares about. And what I think is important and my friends think is important, meaning curatorial colleagues, is not important to most people. And that was the toughest lesson in the Ballantine House, is that what matters to me is not what matters to the general audience in almost any museum. The general audience, not even at the Metropolitan, the vast numbers of people are lay people, not experts. So, but it's very hard to guess that, I mean, because as Tracy said, everything we think is contaminated because we love it all very much, and so we think it's all fascinating. So I think that'd be a great thing to do if somebody would fund that staff person to do that, because that sounds like a full-time job.
I work at Asia Society, and we actually only have two curators, and I'm the only one that's dealing with the traditional or the historical material, and I work on exhibitions, and I'm basically overseeing whether they're outside curated shows or in-house curated shows, and overseeing the content for all of our labels. I have a lot of responsibility, and we have these exhibitions that reflect cultures, a whole range of different cultures. I'm not Asian. I have stronger training in some areas of Asia than others, in particular in the area of China. And we do know that demographically, if we do an exhibition of Chinese art, we're going to get a lot more people of Chinese background coming to the exhibition than, say, people of Indian background. Whereas if we're doing an Indian art exhibition, we'll get more people who are of Indian background coming than Chinese people. So sometimes when I'm working on labels, and particularly in questions that are related to religion, where I'm not quite sure whether if the way I'm phrasing something might be considered offensive or not, I have the luxury of working in an atmosphere that's the Greater Asia Society, that's filled with Asians and Asian Americans, and I often will go to a colleague and ask them to read something over if I'm not sure about it, or if I think something maybe may have a nuance there that I'm not aware of, because I didn't grow up in that culture.
Mm-hmm. I have not had that experience, at least not in recent years. I'm vaguely, again, remembering, the brain is getting old, in my past years at the DIA, that vaguely sounds like sort of an experiment of sorts that we may have taken up during one of our label writing workshops. I don't know if it was one that was led by Chance Scriven, or as a part of the visual thinking strategies, or yet another, because we went through an awful lot. We did a lot of work in that area, which I will commend the museum for having invested that kind of time and research and bringing in experts in that way. But I vaguely remember some situations where we may have sat down, had different teams sit down in pairs with visitors, but more so in a test mode, not to then go back and implement their suggestions in that particular label, but more so in terms of gleaning what, again, was more useful to the viewer versus, things that we provided as a matter of fact.
Okay.
Do you want to take another audience question, or should we go on to the works in a temporary exhibition and what to focus on in a label?
I feel like, let's see if there's another question, because I feel to some degree that elements of that question have been answered already.
Sure. This is an interesting one. It says, what tone do you use in labels, whether personally or institutionally? And for example, do you write in the first person? Do you sign your label?
All about me. I have to, because this is something that's come up. Sometimes the curator of the exhibition will put his or her name on what we call the A panel, the introductory text panel. So if the whole exhibition then becomes sort of their voice, but sometimes it's acknowledging the collaboration of a number of people whose voices you'll hear through the exhibit. What tone? We certainly don't. Have I ever been through an exhibit where the labels have been in the first person? I suppose if it's a personal journey kind of exhibit, which could be interesting actually, but if you'd have to get a celebrity to do that. I don't think anyone cares really what the curator's personal vision is, except you want them to care about what you write. I tend to be very non-academic and also non-formalistic. I'm not an art historian in the way I talk about objects, but it also depends theme by theme. My current jewelry exhibition, which just opened, the theme of that is materials, and materials over geography and across time. So I'm not talking stylistically, I'm not talking formalistically or even function. I'm not talking about necklaces versus brooches or something like that. It's really all about materials and how materials are important in the production of jewelry. When I'm doing this New Jersey ceramics exhibit, it's really the focus is on the clay. We're trying to figure out how to make this interesting to anybody, much less to a wide audience. So we're looking at the technology and the science of ceramics, the geology of ceramics, and then the history of production. And then we get into the basic household functions. What were these things for? Why do these things exist, and why are they in a museum? So the voice very much shifts based on what the point I'm trying to make is. And but I try to avoid a kind of academic or art historic tone in my conversation, but that's my department. I think when you've got different agendas and different material, you have to adopt slightly more formal tones just to get people, just to make things clear.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Well, I likewise, I don't think I've ever written a label where in first person for sure, but I just generally try to keep a conversational tone. But the tone, in my case, again, may vary depending on the venue, which of our venues that the exhibit is going to. So I might write labels in one way for works that I have on view in the art department of the University of Michigan Dearborn, Flint, sorry. And differently, for sure, than the way I write for the public library's children's room. So I, take the audience in consideration in making those, in setting that tone in that way. But generally speaking, it's a fairly consistent tone. Yeah.
The one, I also have never written labels in the first person, but the one exception for exhibitions, I would say, at Asia Society is that every year we have an exhibition which is done through a collaboration with Studio in a School, which is basically a response exhibition to one of our main loan exhibitions during the year. And the students who create the works of art often will write the labels, and the labels will have sometimes be in the first person, describing what it is that they were trying to create in the work of art. But that's the only instance that I can think of where that happens.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can say I've never done that either. I use quotations, but from artists talking about the work in the first person, but not, and I've never signed my labels either. So I personally don't like that experience when I see it in institutions, and or unless it's very well done and part of the overall exhibition theme. So otherwise it gets a little distracting, I think, from what you're trying to do is just point people to look at the object, not not your mini dissertation or whatever. So yeah, to me, I think the best label is the one that makes people read a little bit, look, read a little bit, look, and then move on to the next thing. So that's how I feel about it. We're getting a couple of like nuts and bolts questions too, so maybe we can do we've got 10 more minutes. Adriana, do you want to do like a lightning round of some of these nuts and bolts questions? Sure. Does anyone incorporate quotations and do you cite them? Or cite the source? I think they're meaning like bibliographic sources. Quotations, but not sources. So.
I don't know if anybody else wants to answer the question. I can answer it after if anybody else wants to say something.
Well, I do occasionally include quotes for sure, either drawn from the artist's statement quite often, sometimes citing a quote from a scholar who's done extensive work on that particular artist, or I think of another instance, and sometimes even just as important if my label is trying to put something in a historical context, I may reference something and quote that. But mostly it's the quotes from the artist. But I usually just says, the artist has said, blah, 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 as opposed to true, formal citing, a footnote per se.
I mean, if it's a practical question being asked, if I were to use, I'm trying to think, because I use quotes or quotations from people, but usually in the context of essays or articles or books, not on label copy, but that's because of what I write about, I think. But I wouldn't give a full citation. I would cite the source, the author, but I wouldn't bother to do a whole footnote. And in fact, in the publication, that would become a footnote. So just from a practical point of view, I think you can't really put an entire citation into a label saying where this quotation came from. I have nothing against using quotations, but given what I work with, I don't tend to find contemporary artists who are living, but I rarely give them enough space to allow them a quote. I interpret their words in my label, but so I can see myself doing that, but I would simply use a name and not try to do a full citation.
And I've incorporated quotations in a number of different ways in exhibitions. Sometimes in large typeface on the wall,
Yeah.
you know, in one gallery and then maybe another gallery, trying not to overdo it and overwhelm. And sometimes I do in an individual label as well. But as Ulysses was saying, I wouldn't use a full citation. I think that it becomes too cumbersome and overwhelming for the reader who's just going through, or the audience who's going through the exhibition. On the other hand, when I do use quotes in that way, it's normally with an exhibition that has a catalog that goes along with it, so that the public actually there's a place where the public can go to that's directly related to the show, that has all the bibliographic information that they would need if they're, you know, interested in knowing where that quotation comes from. So it's kind of it's a fallback way of negotiating the situation so that I don't feel like I have to put all that information into the label.
Another question is, do you reference art historical movements that, such as Renaissance, Modernism, Impressionism, that your audience might not be familiar with? And if you do, how do you handle it?
I've occasionally made reference to, say, a school of painting that an artist belongs to. No, and I'm dealing with contemporary art, but say the, you know, Washington Color School or something of that nature. But I explain it within that context. Very concisely try to give some understanding of what, you know, artists working in that style were driving it, what they were trying to achieve. So building the definition into the sentence as well.
Ulysses?
I'm just thinking because that could be a real stumbling block when every time. This comes up in the editorial process for the labels, is that when you put in Art Nouveau, it's not just whether you capitalize it or not, and I can't even remember what we do as our style, but then you have to say, then the editor will say, well, what's that? And I'm thinking, well, Lord, that's a whole other label. So, so I've sort of learned, unless it's central to the point of the exhibit, that I don't use the terms. That unless that's what I'm talking about, unless I'm looking at objects, there's a group of objects that are Art Nouveau, and I have to describe what that means, then that becomes its own separate label. So yeah, we're very careful about, well, and essentially it's art historical jargon, because it's something that we've all been trained to know to one degree or another, but the general public hasn't. So. I'm wondering if I just actually avoid doing shows like that. You know, it's easier when you're talking about materials. I can say enamel, but I describe what enamel is. I mean, it can get very basic as to what people know and don't know, and you can't really make any assumptions. So I guess the bottom line is, if you're going to use any terminology that might not be familiar to a wide swath of your audience, you have to be prepared to explain it somehow. and then you have to learn how to define something like the Renaissance in 20 words or less, which is a challenge as well. Because I used to be very cavalier about saying, oh, here, and all through the Valentine House galleries, we use style terms and we don't explain them, we just put them out there so that people will see them and not be totally alienated by them. I'm not sure that's effective at that, but I used to use lots of style terms when I was talking about 19th century style shifting from the 1830s to the 1890s. But I would be much more cautious about that now unless I was going into depth about what style was all about. Style is something, in fact, I don't deal with very much anymore because we've discovered that that's not something that the majority of our audience really is interested in. That's not one of the prime things in a label that they need to find out about.
I think it takes a lot of skill, actually, to write a label that's articulate and not condescending, and accessible to people at a number of different levels. But I think it can be done. It takes a lot of careful attention to language. On the other hand, and I would agree with Ulysses in that ultimately, when you're writing labels, you have to try to keep the terminology to some degree to a minimum because it becomes just too cumbersome. Every once in a while, though, I do an exhibition where there's so much terminology, say, if it's a show on Tibetan Buddhism, where out of necessity we end up putting together some kind of a glossary that people can take around with them. But I hate having to do that.
Yeah.
But sometimes if it's a particularly scholarly show, then you have to if you have a particular didactic aim with that show.
Well, and this completely the opposite of the complexity of Tibetan Buddhism, just the complexity of ceramic production. I'm having to do glossaries about pottery making techniques, coiling, throwing, slab building, slip casting, and then define them all because I realized I can't use any of those terms unless I explain them to people. And then also ceramic terminologies, earthenware, whiteware, stoneware, porcelain, and then subsets of it was just, and I'm trying to decide how far I need to go and how I need to edit my labels to avoid using terms if I don't want to put them in the glossary. So you're right, that's a complication that comes in even at the simplest levels, and it gets increasingly complex as you're getting into complex and unfamiliar cultures.
I'm actually jumping out of turn here, but I'm just curious what other people do with this too. When you do have a term that you're defining in an exhibition, do you only define it once in the exhibition, or do you define it more than once?
Well, in my case, again, because in my current posts, because the exhibits are self-contained, just one. I'm addressing one theme in one area. I generally just define it once. Although, as I think about it, I can think of a couple occasions where I may have worked on successive floors that continue a theme, and so maybe I should consider repeating it. But I think that. But if I were working from past experience working in a museum environment, I would say that it's worthwhile to repeat it every other gallery or so. And I'm backtracking a little bit. I do just want to say that I don't think it's a bad thing to have to create glossaries, whether they're in the format of a handout or whether they become a wall panel within an exhibition. Likewise with wall panels that maybe deal specifically just with an artistic style. because I've got mixed feelings about the notion. I understand that this is this whole movement toward the elimination of art jargon and whatnot is trying to be more sensitive to our audiences, but at the same time, sometimes I feel that it's almost as though, well, we got the information, we get to know what those things mean, but we don't, oh, you don't need to worry about that, you won't understand it or it'll be too complicated for you. I think that it's nothing wrong with introducing terms and ideas to our audiences that they are hearing in some form or fashion, even in just in pop culture, even if it's on some television show or if they're watching, oh gosh, can't think of the thing where we bring in the works, when people bring in works for expertising and whatnot, but you know, they hear the terms and they never are quite sure. Now, yeah, you can, you know, in this day and age, you can certainly Google anything real quickly, but sometimes it's nice to have that spelled out in the environment that you're in where you're dealing with it. Okay, just had to get that in.
Thanks. I think our time is out. I know that we still have a lot more to discuss. We're going to be able to continue some of the conversation offline later on. But I want to thank all of you, Stephanie, Ulysses, Tracy, and all the audience that has been joining us from outside for joining in and enjoying this really interesting conversation with us.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.